Okay, good evening everybody. Welcome and thank you all very, very much for coming. It's good to see so many people here. My name is Mary-Ann Stevenson and I am Director of the Women's Budget Group. For those of you who are at the AGM, you will know what the Women's Budget Group is, but some of you may not know. So we are a network of academics, civil society activists, trade unionists, women from women's voluntary sector, which works to analyse the impact of UK government economic policy on women and to promote alternatives, and also to promote gender responsive budgeting both in the UK and around the world, which is an approach to the economy that's about thinking about how money is raised and how money is spent and who gains and who loses as a result of that with a gendered analysis. So our panel this evening is on intersectional feminist economics. Now, those are all terms which might be very familiar to some of you here, but won't be to others. So before I introduce the panel, I want to say a little bit about what we actually mean by intersectional feminist economics. First, on intersectionality. This year we're celebrating 2 anniversaries. So for us at the Women's Budget Group, it's our 30th anniversary. Yes, it's also the 30th anniversary of Kimberly Crenshaw's seminal paper, Demarginalising the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory and Anti-Racist Politics. And in this, she used the metaphor of an intersection between roads to describe the ways in which discrimination based on sex and discrimination based on race interrelate in the lives of black women. And although she wasn't the first black feminist to explore these issues, her work's been hugely influential, and the term intersectionality is widely used within feminism, so we thought it was something to celebrate. Now we use the term intersectionality to describe the multiple ways in which different structures of oppression, gender, race, class, disability and so on, interrelate and often reinforce each other. And Crenshaw's work was a challenge to anti-discrimination law. She was a legal theorist that required black women to make a claim either as a woman or as a black person without recognising the specificity of the experience of a black woman. But it was also a challenge to feminist and anti-racist politics. And it's one that it's important for the Women's Budget Group to respond to as a feminist organisation. So what about feminist economics? I suppose at the most basic level, feminist economics is a challenge to the claim that economics is some kind of neutral objective science. So it highlights the fact that the sorts of issues that economists study, the questions that they ask, the type of analysis they use, and the policies that are developed on the basis of that analysis are all based on belief systems that, far from being neutral, are grounded in a particular set of values and priorities. So it's an argument that economics is always political. And what's more, it's an argument that the values and priorities on which a great deal of economics is based are based around male lives, male norms, male priorities. So it focuses on many of the things that economics based purely on the market tends to leave out. So those things that have non-monetary value, human relationships, well-being, the quality of our environment, our sense of personal security and safety, and the vast amount of unpaid work involved in providing care, running a household, taking part in the life of the community. So feminist economics puts these things centre stage. For example, highlighting that societies and the people who live in them depend on the unpaid work of social reproduction as much as paid productive work. So take care. All of us need care at some point in our lives, when we're children, when we're sick, when we're very old. Most of us will find ourselves needing to provide care at some point, to a child, to a parent, to a partner. So being cared for and providing care is a central part of human experience. And the care economy underpins the formal economy. The two are dependent on each other. So feminist economics also highlights how the gender division of care and other unpaid work impacts on women's position in the paid economy. And one of the tools of feminist economics is gender responsive budgeting, which we use at the Women's Budget Group, which highlights how the different positions of women and men in the economy mean that economic policy impacts differently on them. But we also know that gender is not the only structure that affects our lives. So an intersectional feminist approach to economics is one that should look not only at gender, but also at its relationship with race, class, disability, and so on. And that's what we're going to discuss today. And we're really lucky to have with us a panel of expert speakers. Our first speaker is Tracey Warren, who is Professor of Sociology at the University of Nottingham.
We're swapping.
Oh yes, we swapped orders round. Eleanor's going last. She worked in a number of universities, and before that in a nightclub, for a charity, in a shop, in a cafe, in a factory, and at an FE college. Her research interests are in work and employment and intersecting social inequalities of gender, class, and ethnicity. She's written about part-time employment, job quality, work-life balance, underemployment, financial hardship, and domestic work. Our next speaker is Zubaida Haque, who is the Deputy Director of the Runnymede Trust and is also a Commissioner on the Women's Budget Group Commission on a Gender Equal Economy. Zubaida has a strong research and policy background on ethnicity and inequality in education, employment, housing, health, poverty, and criminal justice. She's worked for several government departments, think tanks, and universities, and is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. And finally, Eleanor Lisney is a founding member and Director of Sisters of Frida, a disabled women's collective, and Culture Access, supporting access and bringing an inclusive edge to intersectionality. She's a coordinator of NAO, the National Alliance of Women's Organisations, on the Management Committee of Metro GAD in Greenwich. Eleanor is an access advisor, public speaker, content writer, secretary of the NUJ. It is LIBMM branch. What does that stand for?
London Independent Broadcasting New Media.
Brilliant. Should have checked that with you in advance. Written for Media Diversified. She was on the British Council Disability Advisory Panel and the web team of the International Network of Women with Disabilities. She's a co-founder of Crip the Vote UK and a founding member of Greenwich Disabled People Against the Cuts. So that's our panel. The format of the panel is that each panellist will give a brief introduction, followed by a discussion between panellists chaired by me, and there'll be then time for questions and comments from the floor. What I would ask is, and this is a kind of housekeeping thing for those people who are standing for election to our management committee, is after the presentations by the panel, would you mind just quite quickly going outside so that we can give you the result of the election before they're announced publicly to everyone else, so that you know whether or not you've been elected and whether you want to hang around to hear the formal announcement or not.
Sorry, but is it possible to move the balloon so we can see Eleanor? No. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So I'll remind you again when we come to the end of the speaks. But if you see people get up and walk out, they're not being rude. They're just finding out if they've got on to the management committee. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Tracey.
Thank you. I pressed the button. Is that working? I'm green. No, not yet. Got my arms assistant over there. So first, obviously it's a privilege to be here, to be asked to be here tonight on such a big special birthday. I admit relatively quickly that I'm an imposter. I'm not a feminist economist, I'm a sociologist. But my sociological research often does focus on the economic ramifications of intersecting inequalities in women's working lives. And I was asked by the Commission to think about some of the issues faced by working class women. And this is my kind of summary for the Commission, that working class women perform vital work in their paid jobs. They retain major responsibility for domestic work and caring work within their own homes. Their paid work is undervalued and poorly rewarded. Done. I'm finished. I've got 4 minutes left. But so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my research in the 5 minutes we've got allocated. But we also asked to think about experiences, and we all live in and breathe in intersectional inequalities. I'm thinking about the economic ramifications, which I'm interested in, class inequalities. I wanted to just do a little backstory. So class has been really important to me, you know, a very long time. I grew up in a working class family in the northeast of England, if you're wondering what the accent is going on. And one example of economic inequalities and financial insecurity related to that hit me really powerfully was when I started secondary school. There was more pupils, there was a big comp, loads more diverse students in at my kind of scanty primary school. And it's really topical at the minute. And I don't know if many of you in the room have sent kids off to school and had the whole sort of school uniform nightmare the past couple of weeks. I never worn a school uniform before I went to secondary school, and like many just ordinary schools, you have to buy your school uniform at certain stupid shops, right? And the certain stupid shops are really, really expensive. So, ta-da! So that's my school uniform, as was, still there, still the same horrible blazer. 45 quid, right? I had 3 sisters. I bought this brand new blazer, and my big sister said, "You're going to have to look after that, you've got to make it last," right? I wore that blazer for 7 years by the end. And so I was I also stood out in many ways from other people, other mates in my school, because it was very much a strong culture in my family that as soon as you're old enough, you got a part-time job, you know, so you were 15, 16. And my mum, if anybody knows Newcastle, my mum worked as a cleaner in a posh department store in Phoenix, and she got me a job through my mum working in a cafe of this the groundbreaking menu which introduced the concept of the open sandwich to Newcastle, according to TripAdvisor. So I grew up in a very strong working class background. That's our high street. That's where I mean now my dad still lives there. I'm certainly in a middle class occupation now. I'm an academic, right? But I still stand out. The Social Mobility Commission showed that just 10% of us, just around 10% of we in academia come from working class backgrounds, and so middle class voices still dominate my everyday working life. It's, you know, just part of my job. Part of my job includes I'm really looking to do research and teach wonderful students, and I've had many years of reading these really influential women. So we've got and really influential black women who were challenging us to recognise diversity among women, and to sort of think about, you know, diversity in addition to gender. So we've got Crenshaw up there, and these are quotes from some of my essays I wrote when I was an undergraduate. So these really influential women. So just for the last minute or so, I wanted to just talk about a little bit of my own research. So inspired by these so Crenshaw and other black writers, it was about challenging the kind of dominant, the mainstream, the taken for granted by white middle class feminism. And I've been looking at this idea of work-life balance. We all know it, we all talk about it, it's everywhere, workplaces and so on. And so I've kind of gone back to think about, well, what does work-life balance mean? What do the policies mean when you then apply a class lens to work-life balance? And when you look at that work-life balance narrative, I argue, it's very much about you spending too many hours in the job. You're working in a professional occupation, you're rushing around and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not disputing that working too many hours in the job is not good for the worker, it's not good for the worker's family, their friends, their communities. But is that it? Is that everything? What about those workers who don't have enough jobs? What about those workers who are underemployed, don't have enough to live on? And that's very much not discussed under the work-life balance manner. What about those who work on social hours, have unpredictable hours with 0 hours contracts and so on? These are different routes to imbalance. They're strongly classed, but they've been disregarded because we've got a very, very middle-class dominated debate around work-life balance. And I mean, who, talking about work-life balance, would disregard money and financial insecurity if it was not a middle-class dominated debate? So that's what. So I've been really inspired by Crenshaw and others to think about what does an intersectional feminist approach give us in terms of understanding what's going on in people's lives, diverse people's lives, because only then can we challenge inequalities in people's everyday working lives. And so it's great to be part of this panel. Passing over to you lot, and obviously hearing what you lot have got to say as well. So that's me.
Thank you, Tracey. So, Zubaida, over to you.
labels. Sorry, it's funny that Tracey was talking about labels, because I think from the get-go, I was always going to be a feminist. I was raised by 5 men, and much to their dismay, but I think secretly also that they're proud, they not only made me think like men, but they made sure that I was assertive like men, that I ensured that I could get my way like men, and so on. As for The Economist, I think that's still a learning experience, and I'm still learning. I don't think, I suspect I'm preaching to the converted when I say that it didn't take me long to figure out that the economy is centred around white middle-class men, and particularly white middle-class men who work full-time and have little or no caring responsibilities. What that has meant, of course, and I realised this as when I became a mother, when I was working, when I was balancing everything, what that meant is what counts as work, what's valued as work, what is paid work is all around male norms, male values, male availability, and generally how men have designed the economy. And of course, that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to become one of the commissioners on this gender equal economy. The issue is, for us, is from the get-go, women are structurally disadvantaged in the economy. They own less, they earn less, they do the bulk of domestic care, and they do the bulk of unpaid caring work. Whether that's caring for their children, whether that's caring for parents, whether that's caring for their partners, they do all of that. And it's the feminisation of that work, it's the occupational segregation of that work, it's how that work has been valued, particularly care work, that you slowly begin to understand why it is that women end up being in low paid work, why women's work ends up being undervalued, and why women's work, whether they're in employment or not in employment, is not rewarded. There's a particular issue around gender equality, which is around also gender and racial inequality and the intersection of gender and racial inequality. And that matters. Now, I'm the Deputy Director of the Runnymede Trust. We are a race equality think tank, and we tend to look at... I think Siri's had enough there. Siri's saying, get back to the topic. And so we very much look at intersecting inequalities. We look at inequalities in relation to race, in relation to class, in relation to gender, in relation to disability. And why that matters is because when you come to think about the solutions for what will create a gender equal economy, when you come to look at the solutions for what will be a better economy for someone who isn't a white middle-class man with no caring responsibilities, the solutions are different according to your characteristics. So, for instance, there are 4,735 female professors in this country, but only 4,735, yes, female professors in this country, but only 25 are black. What that tells you is that even if you introduce quotas, even if you introduce targets for women, it wouldn't make that much difference for BME women. And that's because black and ethnic minority women experience disadvantages, experience discrimination, experience stereotypes and bullying that white women don't necessarily experience, either in the same way or as in a pronounced way. And that's why we need different kinds of policies. I also want to talk a little bit about how, with the economy, in terms of changing the economy, it shouldn't just be about policies. Actually, I think it needs to go beyond that. I think it's also a societal problem, it's a cultural problem, and it even goes to language. We talk quite a lot about economic inactivity. I hear it all the time, because, for instance, being at Runnymede Trust, we tend to hear quite a lot about Muslim women being, Muslim women not working, and a high proportion of Muslim women being in economic inactivity. Now, I actually take, I actually don't like that term. You know, I find fault with that term, because why is it if a woman chooses to stay at home and look after her children or her parents, something which the economy couldn't do without, that function the economy couldn't do without, why is that not considered work just because it isn't paid? So I'm going to leave it there. It's a bit of a ramble, but I just wanted to cover that whole area.
Thank you, Zubaida. So, Eleanor, over to you and your umbrella.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you for inviting me, because I find that a lot of I've been to quite a few conferences on intersectionality, and very often disability is left out. So, then we start. I am Eleanor Lisney. I'm a founder of Sisters of Frida. We are a collective of disabled women. I didn't bring a PowerPoint. I brought you a relic. It's an umbrella, and I'm hoping that Emma will help me hold it up. So, this is a relic. Before Sisters of Frida started, let me start with saying that Sisters of Frida has its roots in the BME movement, because at that time I was in Birmingham, and part of WAITS, which is Women Acting in Today's Society in Birmingham, and Million Women Rise Sabrina Qureshi came and asked me to speak at Million Women Rise at Trafalgar Square. At that time, Sisters of Frida didn't exist. I didn't have a banner, I didn't have anything, and I thought, how can we do this? And this is where when we talk about intersectionality, this is where our identities come through as well. I did this, and an umbrella is very much part of the sort of Chinese culture. If you look at Hong Kong, you know, the yellow umbrella, the umbrella revolution, the umbrella for us is a shield as well as a weapon. So on this is disabled women rise. So that was my kind of idea. And then we realized, I dragged my friend Michelle because I didn't want to be the only person speaking. We realized that there was a gap between disabled people's organizations and women's organizations. So slowly we came to talk about, you know, forming something that will straddle the women's sector as well as the disability sector. And from there, we don't say that we represent disabled women, because we can't represent all disabled women. They go across all kinds of, you know, social class, ethnic minorities, everything, white people, and also people who are non-disabled now can suddenly become disabled. So we don't say that we cover it all, but what we try to do, as Sisters of Frida try to do, is be a voice, make sure that at the table there is a voice for disabled women. And it doesn't matter, and talk about the issues that disabled women face. Be it at the UN, and we have been to the UN, we have been to CEDAW, we have been to the CRPD, to talk about the different issues specifically that disabled women face. Whether it's locally, Zubaida was talking about care. At the moment I'm in Greenwich. I'm fighting so that the Greenwich disabled people, because they're threatening to charge for care. And we're telling them the charge isn't just financial. The charge is psychological, is emotive, and it's more than finance. It's the cost of doing this. So we try and be a voice on disabled women's issues, on
health, on domestic abuse, on the media, on discrimination, and also in culture. But our approach, as I said, we started from very much of sort of BME start. So our approach has always been examining privilege and intersectional. And that is one of the foundations. We try to make sure that if we approach anything, you know, it has to be intersectional. And I haven't mentioned pan disability, so it's visible and invisible disabilities, and also for neurodiverse women. So one of the questions that Marianne said was, you know, talk about the practical consequences of the imperfect policies, you know, sort of day to day. And I would sort of say, ask you, turn the question to you and say, what do you do in the morning when you get up? You go to the toilet, you have a shower, you have your breakfast, you go to work. Now think of it if you're a disabled woman. You might have need for somebody to come and help you go to the toilet, and that somebody might not turn up, as carers, as happens. Showers, the same thing, you know. Breakfast, you need somebody to make you tea. All these things, and that is, you know, I'm talking about somebody who needs to work, you know, to make sure. And transport, how can you know that there's accessible transport? As I mean, I'm sure quite a lot of you are Londoners. I'm sure quite a lot of you moan about the daily commute to work. Can you imagine it if, you know, if you're disabled, let's say a wheelchair user, and you find out that King's Cross, the lift doesn't work? You know, what are you going to do? You can't always have a, you know, you need to have plans. You need to have a very understanding boss. Let's put it this way. Just give you another example of when it comes to economics. You talk about work. You talk about how there isn't many BME professors, then even much less disabled ones, let alone if they've got an added characteristic, you know, because it's so tough. Marianne knows that I tried to do a PhD, and I just, you know, couldn't continue after 1 year, and I'll quite happily tell people why later on if you want to know. But my friend, I'll give you an example. My friend Sarah, she's got a first-class degree she's a law degree, so she's a lawyer. She went into the corporate world. She had to leave. Why? Very pedantic thing. She couldn't go to the toilet. I mean, can you imagine that you have a job that you have to give up because you can't go to the toilet? Because there wasn't the sort of accessible toilet that she needed at work. To go to, you know, to go to work and to go to a toilet at home, because she needs something called a changing places toilet. It takes all her lunch break, the whole hour. You know, so she had to give up her job because she just couldn't do that. So this just is some of the practical things. I mean, we have the Equality Act. You know, then we have something called reasonable adjustments. She's a lawyer. She can't make it work for her, you know. So what chance of, you know, other disabled women have? And when I talk about, and that's the difference between the disabled women and disabled men. You can imagine the sort of difference. You know, men don't get periods. You know, you don't need a clean toilet. I'm not saying men don't need clean toilets. I'm just saying that you need it to, you know, you can't. I'm not going to do this. So yeah. So this is just an example, and I'm sure I've used up my 5 minutes.
So what I was going to say is just briefly, as we move into the kind of panel discussion, have we got the results counted? Yes. Would the people who are standing for the management committee just mind going out and getting? I'm sorry about this. It's just we don't want to spring it on people at the end of the thing. So while we're doing that, I've got a question that I wanted to ask the whole panel. And it's something that comes up when we talk to journalists. And if we talk to journalists and we use the term intersectionality, a lot of the time with journalists and also policymakers, we're told that this term is really off-putting, you're being unnecessarily academic, nobody understands what you're talking about. But yet, in other worlds, that's a kind of normal term that people use. So is the term off-putting? How do you explain it to a wider audience? Do you use other terminology? We'll start with you, Tracey, and I'll move along the panel.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting because I think it's a combination of being overcomplicated and also oversimplified. Which is kind of a bit weird because I know Camilla Crenshaw, she did a talk last year at a big conference, and she said she often doesn't understand, that's not her concept when she sees people talking about it. So she's saying people are using it and misusing it from the way it was originally envisaged and, you know, how she wanted it to work. But then, and I guess I also wanted to hear from the room actually about whether they feel it is becoming more acceptable or whether it's equally complicated, because in my area people are unpacking it and really going deep into it and thinking, well, you know, intersections, what about interconnections, what about webs, you know, what kind of metaphors might work better to get people on board with some of these kind of simple as well as complex ideas. So people will talk about webs of inequalities interlocking. So we've got intersections. Is it better to talk about interdependent, interlocking, webbings of inequalities? Yeah. Okay. At this point.
Zubaida.
Well, you can imagine coming from Runnymede Trust when we do a lot of media work and interviews on telly and radio. So actually, to be really honest, Marianne, we try and avoid a little bit using the term intersectionality, because as soon as we're trying to talk to an audience, an everyday audience, we lose half the audience usually then, but we lose them. So actually what we tend to do is say it as it is on the tin, which is we say, look, we're talking about sexism, we're talking about racism, we're talking about anti-disability discrimination, we're talking about homophobia. We tend to talk very much in that way because I think ordinary people understand it that way. And I think they then understand to some extent. I mean, I'm probably saying, we do talk about intersectionality, but our objective, more than anything else, is to get people to understand that discrimination is not a horizontal experience. It's very much a horizontal and a vertical experience, in the sense that depending on what your characteristics are, it can be just gender discrimination, or it can be gender and race, race and disability, and so on. And it matters because of the example I gave to you about black female professors, but it matters at every stage. I mean, even when you think about female graduates, you know, there's a disparity. When we think about pay, we know there's a disparity between men and women, but when you look at women, when you look at the intersections between ethnicity and pay, you find also enormous gaps. You know, so for instance, a black female graduate has a pay gap of around 7% compared to a female graduate. So in that sense, we think it's quite crucial. We also think it's quite crucial to talk about intersecting inequalities because women get overlooked. If we just talk about race, women get overlooked. A classic example, if I have a moment, we talk quite a lot about criminal justice, we talk quite a lot about knife crime. Knife crime is almost entirely seen as a male issue, as a black male issue actually, even though it's not. But it's very difficult for women to get their voices in there, and it's very difficult for black women to get their voices heard. It's not as though knife crime doesn't affect them profoundly. They live in the same areas, they raise their sons, they're with their brothers, their cousins. I mean, it affects them profoundly, but nobody ever asks, how does knife crime affect women? So in that sense, it's very much an everyday experience for us, but we just try not to use it too much in sort of everyday experiences. I don't know.
Well, I think Sisters of Frida itself is intersectional because we talk about women and we talk about disabled, disability. So in that itself, without adding in anything else, we are really intersectional. However, very often I find that, you know, I could be a lone voice because very often I'm in a group or conference or whatever, I'm the only disabled woman. Not only that, I'm very usually the only disabled non-white woman. So, you know, so it's we can't sort of we can't ignore intersectionality. And when we talk to media, and I do belong to the NUJ, so, you know, I think the journalists who belong to NUJ, and I don't include the sort of tabloids like The Sun, The Mail, they generally don't belong. We do have a sort of guidance on how to use terms, but if I'm talking to a group that I don't think will understand what intersectionality, and it would take too long for me to unpack it, I would just say, you know, look at me, look at my, and I'll explain my identity and use that as sort of an example rather than try and dissect a term that, you know, that they might not understand. But however, I think at one conference I did say that intersectionality it's like having being invited to a feast. You know, that there are many tables. I think, sorry, my brain's gone for a minute. That there are many tables, but when you're intersectional, you don't actually sit properly at any table, because, you know, as the ME woman, I go to that table, and then because I'm disabled, then I'm not quite there. I'm still seen as a sort of an outsider. And if I go to the disabled people's organizations, again, I'm not white. Now, the disability sector is still very white. So, you know, is that you're there and it's really good because you are at many tables, but you're never actually properly seated at any one of them. And that's the other side of intersectionality, which, you know, it can be very enriching, but it also can be a very lonely experience. You know, for example, like I was at a conference, I said that it was all about intersectionality, and I think Crenshaw was there. And I was the one who put up the hand and saying, where is disability? You haven't mentioned it at all, you know. And I hate that. I hate to be the person who says, where is the women in this? Or where is the people of ethnic minority in this? But maybe not using the word intersectionality, but you always have to say intersectionality doesn't mean diversity. It's not the same, because some people use that interchangeably.
Yeah, no, that's good, yeah.
I just wanted to sort of think a little bit about why it has become so popular. Certainly in my area, it used to be. I mean, I think when people started to think about inequalities amongst women, there was that kind of idea. Remember that the idea of the additive model. So if you were black and you were lesbian, and you're quadruply more disadvantaged, or quadruply more disadvantaged. So it was this idea that you're just piling them on, right? And now you've got 7, okay, so you're really, really disadvantaged, and you've only got 1, so out of 4. So I think the idea, brownie points. Yeah, brownie points. Come on, bring it on. We want more. We want more. And so the idea that you're not just piling them on, like not just add them on top of each other, but they all come together in very complex ways, and it's simple and complex at the same time. So I think that's why it's powerful, but obviously the challenges.
No, I think that's an important point, that actually, when Crenshaw was kind of conceptualising this, she wasn't talking about this on top of this on top of this. She was talking about the interrelationship of circumstances that meant, she was talking specifically about anti-discrimination law, that anti-discrimination law didn't work because you had to make a claim as a woman, or as a black person you couldn't make a claim as a black woman. And we still have that problem with the Equality Act because the dual discrimination provision wasn't enacted. I've got one more question, which I'll try and be brief on, because I want to hear from the audience, which is about data, and it's really to everybody. One of the problems that we often find at the Women's Budget Group is that you can get data broken down by what the Equality Act calls protected characteristics. So you can get it broken down by sex, or race, or class, or but it's very difficult to get data that actually gives you more intersectional breakdowns, that gives you more complicated breakdowns. And I'm wondering, for example, the government's Ethnicity Facts and Figures website, which is very, very comprehensive, very few of the statistics are disaggregated by sex. So is this a problem that you find, and how do you get around it? Are there ways that we can, get additional data? What do you do to deal with that kind of data gap? I don't know if
it's an interesting, it is an interesting problem, isn't it? This gender data gap, and you're absolutely right, Marianne, to say that on the one hand, we campaigned for a very long time to get ethnicity data. We only now have a government website dedicated to breaking down data by ethnicities. Well, since 2017, it's Theresa May's baby, so to speak. So it's very recent. But the fact that it doesn't disaggregate very much by gender is a problem, because simply put, it means that policymakers think that there's not a problem there. If housing or employment actually is broken down by gender, but housing or poverty or any other public policy area isn't broken down by gender, then policymakers think there isn't a problem, no one's complaining, and of course by default then they make policies which are geared very much towards men. But of course what that does is not only does it erase women in terms of making them more invisible, it gives them no voice. It means that they can't say, actually, the policies that you are implementing are affecting us profoundly. So one of the things, I don't know if many of you know, but the Women's Budget Group and the Runnymede Trust, we worked together a couple of years ago, looking at the impact of budgetary policies, looking at the impact of the Chancellor's budget, and looking at it from an intersectional way. In other words, we asked the question, do budgetary policies affect women more than the men? And do they affect particular women from ethnic backgrounds more than other women? And lo and behold, what we found was that not only do budgetary policies affect women more profoundly than men in detrimental ways, but that it affects black and ethnic minority women more, and that it affects single black female households the most. What that means what that means, or what that meant, is that budgetary policies, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Treasury, were not considering how their policies were impacting on different groups. But it's also interesting to realise that they weren't undertaking any impact assessment of budgetary policies either. So in that sense, data matters very much. Data also matters because, as I said, if you don't have the data, then you can't come up with the solutions. And in that sense, I think what we need to do now is campaign for much more data by gender. We've got the race disparity audit. I would argue that we need to have a unit that's dedicated almost exclusively to the impact of the budget.
Yeah, Tracey?
I guess my job is to analyse data and disaggregate data. And it's weird because there are some really, really good, valuable data sets out there, and I know some people in the room have worked on them. I work on a really large data set which has followed families over time from 1991. So Omar is like Omar Khan is Runnymede is kind of an expert advisor on that, and you've got the BAME and sort of booster samples. So there's loads of information on that. It's very hard to get funding to have time to do that analysis. You want to do that analysis with stakeholders. You want to do co-production, and what you do is you spend your entire life trying to get funding to do that, rather than actually, it's just a battle. It's just a pure battle. We want to do the analysis. We want to do it with activists. We want to, we want to refine those questions. We've got some really good data out there. The funding is getting harder. In terms of my research into quality of work and life and stuff, and certainly in terms of the national picture, it's looking scary as well, because we often look to something called the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions. They do big national pictures, see how the UK is comparing with other, and what's going to happen. They're already not talking about us. They're already just talking about it's the EU, so it's a tricky position, and it's getting harder, really. But I completely agree. We need the data because we need to inform discussions. We need to know what's going out there. We need to know trends over time as well. We really need that quality data. We need to compare it over time. And we need to break it down by everything you said, as well as you were talking earlier about like locality and all the other kind of dimensions of inequality.
Data when it comes to disabled women or disabled people is a bit problematic, because I think the government tries to hide the data. You can ask how many people were impacted by the austerity, for example, and they have proof that the DWP actually lied. They lied about assessments. They lied about so that sort of data is probably you can only get from the Freedom of Information requests, and with Sisters of Frida, which was more for doing that, and we're not the researching thing, but we do go to the UN, we do try and write shadow reports, and we do note the lack in data, and all the sort of UN people who have come over have said that you need to have disaggregated data, and then we said but all the disabled communities so involved and so sort of focused on austerity and how to help disabled people. Looking at data might seem irrelevant almost. Worldwide, there is something called the Washington Group set of data, which is in the States, and so they have like surveys, specific surveys, so that it's kind of uniform all over the world, so you can look at them and make analysis. But I don't know many people in the UK that actually took that on board, except a disability organisation called Leonard Cheshire, of which I personally wouldn't have anything to do with, because they're known for incarcerating disabled people, and they're using that's going to be a bit political, so I won't say anything.
Have to be political, Eleanor.
Yeah, but there you go. See,
Yeah.
those are the people who've got the money, who've got the funding to do this kind of thing. So how reliable is their data? I don't know, because I'm not involved in these sort of government things to look at that.
Briefly, Zubaida, because I want to hear from you.
I was just thinking, there's a limit to data though, isn't it? It's really interesting that when I think about the Windrush scandal, when I think about knife crime, when Runnymede Trust talk about these issues with the media, when we're trying to talk to the public about these issues, data only gets us so far, because we need to engage people, we need to capture their imagination, we need to capture their empathy, and actually at the end of the day, what tends to shift them, what tends to shift the public and the media, are the case stories, are people talking about what it was like for them, ordinary, everyday people, what it was like for them, how they've been trapped, how they've been held back, how their experiences have got worse. And I think, so we are in changing times, so at the same time, as much as we need data, I think there will be limits to what we can do with that data.
Yeah. We need numbers and we need stories. So, questions and comments. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take them in groups of 3, so as many different people as possible get a chance to say something. You should have a mic in front of you, so if you press the button and the light goes green, you will be mic'd and people should hear you. I saw Annette's hand up there. Anybody? Yes. In the front with the pink, and one more. We'll hear you two. I'm sure someone will put their hands up. Yes, and next to you. Right.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to come back to Tracey. I'm also a sociologist, or was once upon a time, and I worked on longitudinal studies, earlier longitudinal studies. And I also want to support some of the things that Eleanor's just been saying, because I also know something about disability organisations, and I think one of the shocks that I got with disability organisations is actually how very limited they are in terms of dividing even by men and women. It's depressing, and they don't do that kind of analysis for adults. They also don't do it for children. So you talk about disabled people, disabled adults, disabled children, and what does it mean at the end of the day if you haven't done that basic division by sex? But I want to ask you, where has class disappeared to? Because in my day, and in our early longitudinal studies, it was the classification that was so important, and that led to understanding the kinds of policies that we needed, particularly for social mobility, which was something that steered us all. And actually, I think you're rather unusual, aren't you, in focusing on class? Because nowadays we really don't see it. We are concerned about BME, we are sometimes concerned about disability, we're certainly concerned about the difference between women and men, girls and boys, but class often gets lost, and I'd love to know why you think that is and how we can bring it back centre stage, because it's still so important.
Great. Okay. In the front, yes.
I need to call it. Okay. No, it's good. Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to make a comment, right? If I may, because like Eleanor, that because in terms of disability, well, I think just a broad comment. Like, if we're going to go for data, which I think I agree with you that it's not everything, but if we're going to go for it, we're going to go for everyone, and we're going to go complex. So, and we are our best sources of information, so we need to start with ourselves, the organizations we work with. Like when I worked for Disability Action in East Linton, I did kind of advocacy support work there for 5 years, and we developed our own way of keeping data, and it was complicated. We had 1, 2, 3 columns. Why? Because you could have a physical impairment of one kind, and also a mental health need, and also an invisible condition. So all of that becomes invisible if you don't record it. So then you don't know who the people who have used your services are, and you cannot tell the community of disabled people, look, this is the kind of people that we've been supporting, and this is what's been going on. You can't tell the council and the founders and everybody else. So I think that it needs to go all the way. Like, you know, we all play or we break the cards, yeah? So we have to, all of us, be included. And then in terms of intersectionality, even though I think it is difficult, and I have found it difficult, I've said I've found it difficult, the term, you know, it's like, oh, because, you know, like Crenshaw also stood in the shoulders of giants, you know, like when Barbara Smith and others wrote a book about all the men are black, all the women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. What she was saying is that, she was saying, where are we, yeah? And they, at that time, were not bringing disability or other issues with it, but they were trying to say, it's, in fact, the best that I've heard before Crenshaw was the African-American poet Pat Parker in a chapter in the book, This Bridge Called My Back, where she says, I want to be able to walk into a room and be all of who I am. And she was an African-American, and she had this pylon, but it was not pylon, she was embodying all of these people, all of these aspects of the character. Yeah. So that's what I just wanted to add that.
Okay. And then I'll do the panel and I'll come back.
Well, I'll say a little bit. My name's Louise Simpson, and I've probably worked in, I've worked in local government, children's social care, data, a lot of that, and also set up a workers' cooperative, always 50% or more women around this stuff. Over time, one of my questions is, are we actually just mimicking the male agenda, really, when we talk about data and characteristics? And because I feel, my background is actually physics, I feel the whole thing is highly reductionist, a bit like what you were saying, really. The idea that we are basically, you know, it's a catch-22 that we're trying to prove our case on their terms. Or, you know, all of our cases that isn't the white, you know, privileged white male case, everybody else is at a disadvantage, because if nothing else, we're trying to prove it on their terms. And more I feel like you, I feel like, why are we playing this game when actually, you know, families, troubled families is an area I've worked in, which is in itself extremely troubling as a concept, because it's, you know, it is about poverty and relationships and engagements that aren't working well between different services. It's got absolutely really nothing to do with the classifications of these people, who are then almost being demonised and classified into failure. You see what I mean? So I mean, my question is really around, for me, you know, how come we're all driven down the quantitative data line when we're talking about people, when in the past, you know, anthropologists or anyone else would be talking about ethnographic data, because these are social issues, they're not scientific issues, and we've been forced into trying to describe people as if, you know, and I've worked in all sorts of council services, but we're trying to describe people like lampposts, when they're nothing like that. Families, you know, my problem in a lot of the work that I was doing is families, troubled families, we're trying to classify as if they were lampposts that can be measured by, you know, what's the wattage and what's the height, you know, that sort of thing. And I fundamentally think we shouldn't be on their terms in this whole area. I think we should be talking much more about stories. I mean, I don't know what I think.
So, Tracey, I mean, pick up on any or all of those points or comments, but presumably, hopefully, the first one about what's happened to class.
Thank you very much. I completely agree. Class should be centre stage. It is so important. And you're right. And I think certainly kind of the idea of the death of class, you know, and taken over by other kind of identities like sexuality and so on. I think sometimes people talk about class without use of the word. You know, a bit scared of that word. Certainly policymakers don't. You know, we talk about deprivation and the poor and those in poverty, and you're going, just say the word. Just say the word. I know you want to say working class. So it kind of really had disappeared. But when you think about recent debates, they're just about managing the ordinary working families. In fact, Teresa May actually said ordinary working class families at one point. So you kind of see it like dipping back in, and I think the impact of austerity and all the research that you lot have done around austerity is kind of how this is. You kind of be avoiding this so much. And certainly within sociology classes back, it kind of disappeared for a bit. People went a bit kind of cultural, but it is back. We're doing a lot more on it. So I'm not as unusual as I used to be. There's more of us and doing kind of really nice work. And obviously, if you want to talk more about the thing, but I think that it links right exactly to your point, because I mean, my discipline is all about multi-methods. It's about words and voices and images and as well as numbers. I could talk about my own multi-methods research, but I'm not going to. I'm going to plug Sarah Marie Hall. I've just got her name completely wrong. Sarah Marie.
Sarah Marie Hall, yes.
Yeah. So
yes.
Who's Women's Budget Group.
Yes.
I just completely, and she does the most beautiful work about austerity, and she's speaking to people in like Rotherham. She's going around the country. I hope she's there watching this. Talking to people about their lives, getting their voices, getting their images, and she's doing comics, and it's just brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Really getting beautiful stories and getting it out there without the numbers, So it's just you need. I think you need all of it, but you need the big picture. You need those kind of statistics that you've been telling us before, as well as those words. I'll shut up because I'll just carry on.
Class is very much back, I'm afraid, because even in relation to our work, Runnymede Trust have just finished 2 out of 3 parts of a project on race and class, where we've interviewed hundreds of people about how they identify in terms of race and class, and particularly talking to them about working class. It's very interesting when you ask people about being working class and you look across ethnicity and you look across age bands, and when you ask young people about being working class and how they of course dissociate themselves much more from it, because they have much more sort of intersectional identities. So we've just done a huge project on that, and one of the reasons we were motivated for several reasons. One, because of Grenfell Tower and what happened there, and to talk about the erasure of working class. But of course, in Grenfell Tower, most of the people who died were predominantly ethnic minority working class. But you don't hear that in the same way that you don't hear about the left behind that supposedly voted for Brexit. The assumption about the left behind is that they're white working class men. It was very much the assumption. You still hear that. But of course, not only does that erase the experience of women being left behind, but it also erases the experience of ethnic minorities being left behind. They are also the working class. And in that sense, I would say that class is very much back. I think there is an issue about reclaiming it as a positive identity, as opposed to a detrimental, negative and problematic identity, but it's very much back. I completely agree with you about the importance of having mixed data. When I say data, I never just mean quantitative data. I also very much mean qualitative data, because as I've said, I think a lot of experiences can't be measured, as you rightly put it. A lot of experiences are complex. So the best way, as Marianne was saying, is to get people's stories. And I think it's when people, and I'm going to go back to Windrush, and I don't know if you remember the stories, but when they talked about how they were stripped of dignity, how they lost their jobs, how that made them feel, that kind of data can't be measured at all. It's very difficult to measure that. So we absolutely agree. I would say that looking at a gender equal economy, I think you're right to point out that we need to be careful that we don't look at it in terms of the male agenda and sort of in terms of patriarchal norms and values. There is very much a danger of that. At the Commission on Gender Equal Economy, and we've got the odd commissioners here, and I thought I saw the chair here as well, Diane, somewhere. we're very much trying to challenge that. We're very much trying to look at the economy from a completely alternative perspective, where we say, look, it's not about GDP, it's not about even men or women necessarily. It's about looking at it differently, and it's about asking questions of how can we do things differently so that it benefits not just women, but anyone who's not a white, privileged, middle-class male.
Eleanor.
Yeah, I'm going to start with Anna's question, data, and not data, class. I wonder if you've heard a book by Claire Ainsley, who is the executive director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. She wrote a book of which I was very proud. She sent it to me, called The New Working Class, in which she talks about ethnic minorities as part of the new working class. And I've always said that when people say, so, you know, I always sort of like disassociate myself from any class question. I said, well, I wasn't brought up in this country. You can't class me by what school I went to, you know, what, if I went to a council estate or anything like that, because however, my father was a cowherder, so you know, where does that put me, kind of thing, you know. So, but Claire is very good, and I totally recommend her book about, you know, how she involves the sort of ethnic minorities in this question of class as well. And she lives in York, up in North East. So, and on disability, I totally agree. And one of the problems, if I can say problems, of being disabled or disabled people is a lot of disabled people have to self-identify themselves as disabled. So, you know, when it comes to hard data, unless you follow what the government says, you know, the government has said, well, they get PIP. That's why it's so important for them to get like the DLA or the personal independence payment, because this is the gatepost. This is how you can get benefits, how you can actually class yourself as disabled, you know, because or else you're not entitled to any of those sort of so-called benefits of if you want those sort of benefits, and all the whole system of stigma and things like that. So how do you put them in the data sets? I don't know. So you're right, you know, I wouldn't say I'm lucky, but my disability, my impairment is very visible. I have friends who's not, you know, who has maybe mental health issues and things like that, and they have barriers that are equally difficult, but they don't get any sympathy, if I want to call it sympathy, from the public, because the public don't see them as disabled. So, you know, yeah, I mean, the whole identification, if you want to call it, of being disabled, and not a person with disability. I haven't mentioned the social model of disability at all, and that is to say that disability is being disabled or disability is part of the environment. It's how the environment imposes on you to make you disabled. For example, I am disabled if I can't come into this building because there are no ramps and no lifts. But if they're there, then I'm less disabled because I have access. And in that sort of way, we class the social model of disability because it's your environment, it's how people view you, it's also attitudes, you know, attitudinal barriers, etc. So that it's so complex when it comes to disability.
I've got a couple more people. We're running out of time, so I'd like to ask any final comments. Be very, very quick, and then I will go back to the panel for one sentence each. So one person there, one person there, one person there. That's it.
was just wondering, talking with data, what is the panelist opinion on the legislation brought in fairly recently to report the gender pay gap? I think we were going to have an ethnicity pay gap reporting in 2021. Just what progress do you think we've made, and is it actually going to be useful in this lens of this?
Great. Next comment.
How can we do intersectionality as policymakers?
Do intersectionality.
Right. I thought you said D.
Yes.
Hi, I'm interested in intersectionality, not capturing some key characteristics of a person's life journey, not race or class or social mobility, but actually the way their lives are shaped by care responsibilities, which is also something that impacts hugely on their average day and in fact their entire lives. And I'm particularly interested in why that isn't being captured in the intersectionality debate and how it might be captured, which would probably be qualitative data and finding out a bit more about what we do need.
Anyone else? Yes.
Hello, hi. I just wondered with the dual discrimination part of the Equality Act, and I believe there's also a part around socio-economic as well, but in terms of the chance of them ever being enacted, really, I mean, I don't know, but the fact that it's in there is hopeful in and of itself, but it's how, what do you think about the chance of, getting that enacted in the future?
Okay, I'm going to go back to the panel for very brief comments each. I'm very sorry, but we need to do the announcements and we need to get out of here because it's not our premises. Yes.
Sorry if I'm just going to pick on the last one because that's directly to me. I mean, there is some progress there. So Scotland, for example, they're working on that kind of the fairer Scotland duty, looking at trying to think about taking into socioeconomic disadvantage and low income and so on. But so that's 2018. But what they're saying is it's actually very difficult to measure class. It's do we look at objective measures, subjective measures? Class isn't necessarily. Do you look at parental? Do you look at what your dad was doing? Do you look at how to your point about bringing everything in? So there seems to be some progress in Scotland. So it can be there if the will is there. And I think I'll show up now earlier. And I think just the whole thing about what we're doing is we're challenging and we're trying to change in that debate. And that's what my job. I mean, the whole thing about left behind. I was like, oh my God, no, working class communities are not left behind. They are being destroyed. It is not passive. It is so that's what we're doing. Then we're battling it, and that's the only way. There's some positive, but there's so much left to do. And so you're letting me respond to that.
Right, gender pay gap reporting and ethnicity pay gap reporting, absolutely crucial. Not because you necessarily want to get a hold of the data, although of course I think, as you rightly point out, unless you record the data you don't know what's going on, but because it forces people to figure out what's going on in their workplaces. It forces employers to think, actually, are there problems around recruitment, are there problems around progression, should I be doing anything? The limits of the reporting at the moment is that that's all they have to do, mandatory wise, and it means that employers can play with their figures and can do all sorts of things, all sorts of magic to hide some of the gaps, to explain away the gaps, if you like, without actually having to do something about it. So that's a limit, and I think that's the next thing that we need to say, is that there need to be equality action plans. Intersectionality as policymakers, I think if you want to do more around that area, a good place to start is around the work that we've done, around the work that Runnymede Trust have done with Women's Budget Group, looking at the impact of the budget on women, on ethnic minority women, on single households. That's when you really understand how policies affect different groups and affect some groups in a profound way that they end up being trapped in poverty. Carers is a fundamental issue. We're talking quite a lot about that at the Commission. It's one of those ironic issues where, on the one hand, every single one of us will be a carer. will either be a carer or will be cared for at one point in our lives, or both. And I think it's becoming a political priority with an ageing population. It's fundamental, but it's a very gendered issue at the moment. It's a gendered issue, it's a horribly low paid issue. Hopefully as time changes, as more men become carers, I bet you things will change, but we need to do a lot more around that. Socioeconomic duty, absolutely crucial. We can see it in education. In education, we talk quite a lot about working class voice. You know, you suddenly see the data being recorded there, but we need to do a lot more. So I think we need a lot more campaigning around that.
Eleanor, a couple of sentences.
There's definitely more disabled men being employed than disabled women. That's all I'm going to say about gender pay. Gender pay gap. And on carers, I know quite a lot of carers who are men and children. So I don't know if it's always a gender question. And seems quite normal to think that, you know, it's a gender question, but
Is it an intersectional question,
This has been a really, really fascinating discussion. We could talk about it all night, but unfortunately we can't. So I would like to thank the panel.